Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome. If you don't know me, my name is Monica, and I'm the co-chair of the NextGen London group. And if you've never attended any of our events before, we're a group focused on kind of sharing knowledge and providing networking opportunities for PR and communications practitioners in the earlier stages of their careers. We've done several events over the past year focused on different topics such as purpose-led communications, communications in financial services, and also on mentoring. All those events were recorded, so if you wanted to go and check them out, you can find them on the PRCA's YouTube channel, just like this event later. And yeah, like you can say, based on the topics, we really love collaborating with other groups and providing our members with opportunities to learn about different sectors and specialisms of communications, because we think it's really important to build a global knowledge of the industry. And we think that public affairs are such a huge part of that, which is why we're really delighted to be today partnering with the NextGen Public Affairs Group. And the reason why you signed up is because we're going to be talking about the recent David Cameron and Lex Greensill affair, and also about what the lobbying industry might look like in the future. In terms of how the event is going to go today, there's going to be a discussion first, and after that we're going to open the room to your questions. You can use the Q&A feature during the course of the event, and we're going to try to answer as many questions as possible at the end. I'm going to hand it over to Lizzie from the NextGen Public Affairs Group now to introduce herself and then introduce our guest.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Lizzie. I am the chair of the PRCA NextGen PA committee. So like NextGen London, we represent people in the early stages of their careers, but across the public affairs industry. So we put on events, we represent people at the PRCA PA board, and hopefully over the next half of this year, we'll be moving back into in-person events. So we can't wait to see some of you face-to-face over the next few months as well. I'm joined today by Matt Honeycombe-Foster. Matt is the policy editor at Politico, and many of you will have read his London Influence newsletter, which is fast becoming one of the must-read publications for the lobbying industry across the UK. I'm going to let Matt introduce himself and in a moment, but we're really pleased to have you, Matt, and we're looking forward to discussing how Greensill, Cameron and lobbying all fit together and what that's going to mean for regulation of the industry going forward as well.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, as Lizzie said, I'm a policy editor at Politico Europe, so I spend a bit of my time thinking about Brexit and trade, but a lot of my time thinking about lobbying and being a bit of a nerd on lobbying regulations. So it's thrilling to have interest in this story. I know you guys are always keen to follow it, so great to be here.
So can we just start then by walking through when you first became aware of the story and the fact that Cameron's lobbying was actually a factor in kind of the wider Greensill collapse?
Sure. Well, I mean, like everyone else in Westminster, I'd been following the FT and the Sunday Times reporting on this. And, you know, at the top, I should sort of doff my cap to Gabrielle Pogrund at the Sunday Times, Robert Smith and the great team at the FT, who really have been asking the right questions on the collapse of Greensill for a long time. There's really kind of three aspects to the story that I think are like why it's grabbed so much attention in Westminster and why it's been on the radar. The first is the seniority of Cameron. So there's a real kind of human interest in this story. This is not just some random ex-DEFRA minister sort of trying his or her luck. I mean, not to like knock DEFRA, but this is the former Prime Minister, a key public figure until very recently in office, seeking access to public money for a financial firm that ended up getting into great difficulty with real world implications for jobs. So like ultimately this was an unsuccessful lobbying attempt. But I think if it had been successful, this story would be even bigger. But it is really hard to think of an ex-PM or somebody in Cameron's position attracting quite so much controversy post-government for lobbying work, particularly lobbying the UK government. I mean, Tony Blair got himself into a tangle over his post-government consultancy work, but this is directly tapping up contacts from his time in office. And so there's been a real interest in him personally. There's been the kind of old school flavor to it of literally the quiet word in the ear that David Cameron warned about, the fact that he came out and spoke about lobbying as the next big scandal waiting to happen, made it quite an obvious sort of story to tell, and the quite sort of chummy nature of the interactions in the text messages meant that kind of Westminster watchers and people in the bubble have just been really interested in a way they may not have been in a story that was just about Greensill more broadly. But I think like the kind of bigger stuff, the access Greensill was afforded while Cameron was in government is really striking. The questions, the decade-long questions about how Whitehall manages conflicts of interest are really important. The seeming ability of Lex Greensill to kind of rove around Whitehall and give his advice and discuss projects with officials that we now know through reporting they had concerns about is a really big one. And I think MPs have been quite animated by the idea that that Cameron was able to get a degree of access, sorry, that Greensill was able to get a degree of access that companies in their constituencies weren't able to. And then I think the third aspect that like got us really interested in the story is and the really striking thing is just how much it's shown, and this is something the PRCA talks about a lot, but just shown how flawed the system of lobbying transparency in Westminster currently is. You know, ministers have tried to argue, this has been one of the most frustrating things of the story has been ministers have tried to argue that loads of this came out because of transparency, and it didn't. It came out through freedom of information requests. It came out through journalists being really annoying. It came out through people having to go around the kind of usual channels by which you might expect this kind of information that's in the public interest to come out. So yeah, I was switched onto it in the same way everybody else was, and I can really see why it's captivated people in Westminster. I think it's brought a lot of issues to a head and bundled them up into one story with a very kind of interesting protagonist that we're all keen to know what he did post-government.
And was there any sort of initial reaction around Westminster and Whitehall when the story broke? Was there any kind of initial concern then? Did they realise how much of a attention it was actually going to get?
So it sort of felt like one of those ones that was just bubbling away for a while and then suddenly exploded. And I think it really reached tipping point when the interactions with Rishi Sunak became public, and then that got a new lease of life with the revelations about Bill Crothers being both paid by Greensill and then going on to and then working for them while in government. But I don't think people quite appreciated the scale of it until the Sunak moment. And then I think, like I said, there was kind of a genuine surprise that someone this senior was afforded this much access without any real way of us finding out. Yeah, I think that definitely raised eyebrows.
So we've now obviously had a lot of inquiries being launched. We've had a lot of evidence sessions, not least with David Cameron himself. And although a lot of those are centering on Cameron and Greensill and the specific role of those two players in this, is there a wider issue, do you think, in Westminster about generally about the access that some of these individuals can have to senior ministers across government?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a wider issue. Although the Cameron stuff is the kind of the sexiest bit of it, there is a systemic issue here that this is revealed, and I think this gets to the heart of why the Greensill story is not just a bubble story. It does have a real public interest. It kind of looks like there isn't a level playing field here. It's shown how essentially the UK. I don't want to over-egg it, but the UK doesn't really have a system for preventing former ministers and senior officials from going on to lobby government. There's a very reasonable argument that we don't want to slam the revolving door shut, that we don't want to dissuade former politicians from having a career beyond Westminster. I've spoken to people with experience at the centre of government who say, look, kind of be careful what you wish for here. that talented people aren't going to get into politics if they think it's going to be a career killer. And the interchange between the private sector and the public sector has been something that's been encouraged by successive governments, Labour and Conservative, for decades. Lex Greensill was brought into government, as was Bill Crothers, and a whole generation of senior civil servants into the Cabinet Office to bring in business thinking and to shake things up and to challenge conventional wisdom in Whitehall, and also to kind of better arm Whitehall when dealing with private sector suppliers. So there's a genuine policy case for having that interchange between government. The question here really though is kind of where do we set the boundaries? Where do we think it's reasonable to set those, and how do we sanction people who cross those boundaries? And at the moment, it doesn't seem there's a system in place to adequately do that.
And do you get the sense that this is an issue that the government's actually engaging with? Are they working on a solution to some of these problems, or is this more of a situation where they've commissioned inquiries just so they can commission an inquiry rather than kind of really tackle the issue?
Well, there's always a danger with government of commission an inquiry and that shuts it down. And it has been notable how basically every query you will make on lobbying regulation at the moment comes back with the Boardman review is happening. So you get punted to that as a kind of stock response. I don't want to assume to be get in the mind of Nigel Boardman. He is well respected in Whitehall. His review of procurement practices was robust, and the government did act on the basis of it. So I think the government is taking the Boardman review seriously. What seems to be happening is that there was already a review of lobbying regulations going on by the Cabinet Office, which long-running fans of London Influence will know. We were talking about sort of late last year. The government was already doing pre-legislative scrutiny of the UK's lobbying laws. It now looks like they're going to wait until Boardman's reported before we get any movement on that. So the two are related. But I think in terms of is the government taking it seriously, the signs that we're going to get some sort of big overhaul of lobbying regulation as a result of this story are to me not really there yet. So if you want a kind of sense of government thinking at the moment, there's a report I covered in today's Influence by Greco, international anti-corruption watchdog. They're not exactly a household name, but the UK is a member of Greco, and it has quite a robust and recognised system for tracking corruption and conflicts of interest in government. It says the UK's got a pretty good system, so I don't want to over-egg the pudding. But in their response to Greco, the government said they weren't minded to include in-house lobbyists in lobbying regulation. They weren't looking to extend the register to include contact with special advisors or other senior civil servants, exactly the kind of things the PRCA has been asking for. And people in the industry meetings that were going on pre-Greensill were very pessimistic when they spoke to me about, the prospect of sizable changes to the lobbying setup here. So, let's not preempt it. Let's kind of wait and see what happens with Boardman. I think whether Boardman comes back with very specific regulations or whether recommendations, or whether it's just a kind of lessons learned exercise will determine whether there's a degree of political pressure around that. But I wouldn't say it's top of the government's agenda at the moment.
In terms of the transparency of government, I think one of the really interesting things about this story for me is how many ministers were initially saying, never heard of Greensill, never spoken to him before, and after publishing their register of interest, turns out they had many meetings with him and Cameron. Is there any kind of interest in looking at how ministers disclose these sorts of meetings, whether or not that process needs to be tightened up, or is that again something that the government's not particularly looking at doing at this point in time?
I think there should be a focus on that. It's one of the most frustrating things as a journalist when you're wading through these transparency releases, which the transparency releases are usually timed for political purposes, right? They come out at a time that is convenient to the government. They have an obligation to publish these transparency releases, but they are often lacking in detail. They often give a really, really general view of what the conversation was about. So a case in point, right? the Treasury releases on Greensill don't mention David Cameron at all. So we have no way of knowing from those public releases the most interesting aspect of this story, which is that David Cameron was lobbying the Treasury. Again, that's down to the watchdogs of the Sunday Times and the FT to tell us. So that data doesn't do what we hoped it would do when it was set up and when it was supposed to sit alongside the all-call register. The meeting between Matt Hancock and David Cameron that made the front page of the Sunday Times is nowhere in the transparency data because it was deemed a political meeting at which presumably they didn't discuss any aspect of government policy at all. So there's really clear loopholes in the transparency data. And you talk to people like Transparency International, they're banging their heads against a brick wall, trying to get the government to listen on this. My understanding is you don't need big sweeping legislation to tighten up the transparency data. You need a change in guidance at the Cabinet Office, and that could be done quite quickly. But where's the political incentive to do that, I guess? If that doesn't sound too cynical, tightening transparency data is not going to be top of the government's agenda, even if it should be.
And if we look at this from a reputational point of view, we've obviously, Cameron was not hired as a lobbyist, but was essentially acting like one, and he was someone who was very useful to Greensill because of his contacts book. There are lots of instances like that where we have former ministers acting as advisors to private companies who may not be there as lobbyists and may not be engaging in lobbying, but if something happens, they have a lot of people they know who still work in government.
Yeah.
Do you think that practice is now going to become less popular, the practice of hiring an ex-politician for their contacts is going to become rarer just from a reputational perspective, or is this still viewed as a bit of a Cameron story and a kind of Cameron's judgment rather than a more systemic thing?
That's a really interesting question, because if you look at the stories that are in the headlines, the lobbying scandals that are in the headlines, they are almost always focused on an ex-minister or an ex-official doing that contacts book lobbying. And they're not usually focused on the sort of bits of the industry that, PRCA members would recognise. I think it should make firms more cautious about hiring former politicians just for their contacts book. People I speak to in the industry kind of point out that lobbying, and you guys all know more about this than I do really, but it's about more than just having a whacking great contacts book. For all the kind of hype here, David Cameron didn't succeed in his lobbying efforts because he didn't persuade the Treasury that access to this COVID lending scheme was in the public interest. So he had the contacts, but he didn't make the argument. And lobbying done right is about making effective arguments, changing minds. And yes, having a knowledge of the system is important. Getting the meeting is helpful, but if you get the meeting and then you don't make the case, I think people need to be cautious about just because this person was an effective politician means they're going to be an effective lobbyist. People in my profession often go into comms and think they can do it just because they've been a journalist, and then they find it's actually a totally different skill set and they're not as good at it as they thought. And I think sometimes a bit of humility from politicians that they can just waltz in and act as a lobbyist would be welcome. I spoke to one sort of Whitehall insider who'd been around the block a bit on the political side and said that they thought lobbyists who show off their contact books are snake oil salesmen, that getting that hearing is not the thing. It's the argument you make. And I would say, if any positive comes from this, it will be firms are a bit more cautious about just getting a big name and expecting that to do the job for them.
And do you get the sense that there's any sort of difference in the way that these different types of official and unofficial lobbyists are viewed in Westminster and Whitehall? Is that if somebody kind of pops into an email inbox kind of asking for a meeting, is it viewed differently if it's coming from a sort of a registered agency versus somebody that you knew 10 years ago from another job?
It's hard to tell. I think the general view of lobbying in Westminster is a kind of grudging respect that it's part of life in Westminster for kind of good or ill. I think certainly MPs, they might not like lobbying. Some of them will see it as a bit of a kind of dirty word, but you you can bet that most of them at some point will have learned something new, or had their minds changed, or had their horizons expanded by engagement with lobbyists. Perhaps if we cast lobbyists quite broadly to include campaigners and people in charities and trade unions, but all MPs engage with people on the outside, and have a case made by them. I'm not entirely sure that MPs will sit there and make the distinction between whether somebody is, for example, on the Orcal register, or whether they abide by a particular code of conduct. I think those things are really important in terms of the industry showing it takes ethics and standards seriously. But I don't know whether the average hard-pressed MP is kind of going, oh, is this person an accredited lobbyist, or are they outside of the system of regulation? One positive that might come from this scandal is it's once again revealed the massive disparities we have in lobbying regulation, and might make MPs think twice about how's this going to look if it's splashed on the front page of the Sunday Times in a few months, and insist on those kind of formal channels that David Cameron says he now wishes he'd used, rather than the kissing text messages.
And how common do you think it is for people to be using these more informal channels at the moment? I mean, I wouldn't say anybody would think that David Cameron was the only person who was kind of doing things that way, but is it something that's quite widespread, or is it a kind of less common than you might kind of suggest it is, if you're being really cynical about it?
Well, I mean, like everybody, Westminster is like addicted to WhatsApp and increasingly Signal, where messages delete themselves, which is great for transparency. So I think just in terms of tech changing, these less formal channels are going to be a part of life. I think, to the government's credit, one thing it did quite quickly in the coronavirus pandemic on the transparency data was make it very clear that a Zoom meeting counts as a meeting. It didn't have to be in person, because I think some of us who've gotten used to Whitehall's interesting approach to transparency sometimes would have expected it to use that as an opportunity to get stuff off book, but actually it did, and we have seen, although flawed, logging of those meetings. People aren't going to go back to letter writing and ditch WhatsApp if they've and informal channels if they've got the contacts. But I think what's important is that the regulation and the legislation we have keeps up with that. So do we need to broaden lobbying communications rather than just does it have to be a face-to-face meeting to make the grade, or is it a direct approach through digital channels? Yeah, probably yes. But then that comes with the question of maybe we need more resources for the regulators who have to police that, because that's a big job.
Yeah. I'm going to be opening up the Q&A in a few minutes, so please start popping your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box, whichever you prefer. But we also had a new lobbying story today from the Times about how APPGs are used. Again, do you think this is something that has actually crossed the mind of MPs before, that this is a potential loophole that's being potentially exploited by certain groups, or has it genuinely not occurred to them that there is a kind of a transparency issue with the APPGs? So,
I mean, yes, they were thinking about it before. So the Standards Committee has been looking at this for a while. I think the inquiry's been kind of gathering evidence, but we haven't had any evidence sessions or anything like that. But the Standards Committee, chaired by Chris Bryant, has been looking into APPGs on the basis that the numbers have ballooned since we last looked at them. And there are real questions about, being able to use the parliamentary portcullis on reports, and the relationship between sort of people who provide secretariat services and whether they should have to disclose their clients. I think MPs like APPGs. They like the ability to talk about specific issues, and they like the ability to work across both the Lords and the Commons, which is something that doesn't always happen and can be quite difficult. But yeah, I think there's going to be more and more scrutiny of APPGs. My colleague Annabelle did a really good story a few weeks back on tech lobbying through APPGs, and just how much money is going from tech companies into all party parliamentary groups. I think MPs find them useful, but it's a bit like all of this, where like do we need to tighten the rules around them is exactly what the Standards Committee is going to be looking at.
And do you think there is a kind of understanding from MPs that maybe not all APPGs are created equal or run in the same way? You know, is there a sort of unofficial kind of tier of standards for how these APPGs are run that MPs sort of have an understanding of, or do they just sort of take each one as it comes?
I'm not sure. I think it's a bit like the approach to lobbying, where some MPs will see, you know, if it's a charity or it's a cause that they already believed in and agreed with, being involved in an APPG supported and funded by that particular interest feels like an okay thing to do, as long as that's declared. I think some APPGs raise the alarm bell with me when I look at them, because it never seems clear to me what the purpose of them is. And you will have quite a bland, broad brush description of what they're going to be talking about. And I think that, you know, the danger is that they're a way to sort of get business recommendations, the official stamp of approval that comes with the parliamentary portcullis and stuff. I think MPs are, if they're already interested in a cause, they'll want to join the APPG. But yeah, like, it's a massive issue, and there are so many of them, and we don't really have a system of strong, robust oversight for them, that it does feel a bit, you know, not to use the Cameron cliche, but the next big thing waiting to happen, right? And it's on the front of the Times today because people are already starting to ask these questions about it.
And the other one, which seems to be something that kind of bubbles up every so often, is parliamentary passes, and who has them, who keeps them after they leave office, and who they're sponsoring to get them while they're in office. Given that it's something that it feels like we've had the conversation quite a few times over the last few years, it always pops up after every general election as well. Again, is there any kind of interest in changing that system, or any kind of real need to change the system as it currently stands? Yeah,
I mean, I think that the PRCA research that was out today, that the Times picked up on the scale of that problem, you know, 210 parliamentary passes held by people who aren't connected to Parliament, doesn't feel like a great idea, both from a kind of security perspective and also just from the access they have to Westminster and to decision makers. I might be wrong on this, but I think that's part of the Standards Committee's APPG inquiry as well, is that they are going to look into the use of the awarding of parliamentary passes and see whether any rules need to change. And I know the PRCA's got a pretty strong position on the fact that rules need to be tightened to stop people just roving around the estate and making their point. It feels instinctively wrong to me that happens.
Okay, I'm going to move on to Q&A now. So please keep submitting questions. I'll try and get through as many of them as I can. So to kick us off, do you think that this story, any of the stories we've talked about, has had an impact on how the public views policy making? Is this one of those things that actually just reinforces public perceptions about policymakers lobbying in Westminster, or is this any part of this that you think has actually surprised people?
I don't think it's. I mean, I think the public starts from quite a low base of cynicism about politics, and that's been the case since expenses scandal, and perhaps before then, that the people think, you know, everyone's in it for themselves. You know, I think many of us who work in and around Westminster know that that's not always the case. But I think the fact that Cameron was doing this had cut through. The test I always use is did my nan notice? And my nan noticed this story, and she was really angry about it. She had a lot of time for David Cameron back in the day. And this had cut through to her. So I think people do notice stories like this when it's a big name and it looks like something that just you wouldn't be able to do as a normal person outside of the bubble, get this kind of access. One note of caution, I guess, is, and this is why I guess I'm slightly skeptical about whether we're going to get big changes from the raft of reviews that are coming, is I'm not sure what the political incentive is for the government to have a big fight over this. You know, it's got an 80-seat majority. It's just come out of local elections where Labour campaigned on sleaze and cronyism and the kind of issues that, frankly, are kind of front page of the Sunday Times. They are big stories to us, but it didn't seem to have a huge amount of cut through. Didn't seem to dent the government much. And, you know, this is a government that has in the past had independent recommendations made to it and gone, well, we're going to press ahead with this course of action anyway. You look at the independent advisor on ministerial interests. You know, this isn't a government that is terrified about doing something that it thinks you might get a short-term bit of bubble anger, but not really much for public hit for. So I would just be cautious about thinking this story is going to shift the dial to a degree that the government has to act and has to do a wide-ranging look at all of this. I think what we might end up with is a series of inquiries reporting at slightly different times that all say the government should probably get on with it, and then maybe we'll get a few minor tweaks. But sorry, that sounds really pessimistic, but yeah, jaded hack here.
I think so. The other thing that we've not mentioned is Boris Johnson's flats. So we've got a question here about whether or not rules need to be tightened around party donor contributions, and I guess there's also a transparency issue there, as that Boris Johnson does quite a good job of highlighting for us at kind of regular intervals about who's donating money, what it's for, and where it ends up. So
the question, sorry, should
yeah, do we need to kind of look at transparency around party donations as well as kind of broader lobbying?
I think the declaration of ministerial interests is you know, it's been a big part of this, and the sort of what felt like foot dragging to me on that one, that we had the resignation of the advisor on ministerial interests who would be looking into all of this normally. The big delay in appointing a new one, big delay in then publishing the findings of the inquiry into that. Having almost a timetable by which he or she should report, and then holding the government to account on that, and having some degree of kind of parliamentary link between that ministerial advisor rather than having them just report to the PM, feels like a more robust system for keeping things like this in check. At the moment, we have somebody who can only investigate once the PM gives say so on that, and that's if the person you're investigating is the Prime Minister. That doesn't feel like a great way to get transparency. Not to make any cast any aspersions on Lord Geidt, but if you are operating as a regulator in a system where those are the constraints, you'll work inside those constraints.
And okay, so as well as in-house lobbyists engaging with politicians, many employees within business regularly engage with government officials on regulatory issues. Where, if you were put in charge of drawing up the lobbying regulations, where do you think the line actually should be in practice?
That is a really good question. So interestingly, when I spoke to people last summer, when I was sort of doing the rounds for putting this newsletter together, people in business were really positive about the way Whitehall was engaging through the coronavirus pandemic. They found that actually some of this sort of shift to remote working and just the ability to access people in a formal logged way was kind of game changing to them, and that some of the wariness they felt inhibited Whitehall from making good decisions because they were so scared of something like this. It was actually easing. So I have a lot of sympathy for the idea you don't want to just say Whitehall shouldn't interact with government, with business. Whitehall shouldn't interact with charities. Whitehall shouldn't interact with trade unions, because all of the world's knowledge is not held within the civil service. To me, the important thing is the transparency angle, and I sound like a broken record on this one. I bang on about it like every week to the point it's probably causing people to unsubscribe en masse. But I think the conversations are fine as long as the public knows about them, and as long as that's logged in a meaningful way, that the government is held to account for breaches of that transparency promise. and that there isn't a kind of political game playing about which data gets into the public domain. And it's the same case with the lobbying register, right? If you expand that to a broader group of lobbyists, you still have the contact, but the public knows, and the public can go back and check the receipts almost. And when something like this happens, people can see, oh yeah, it was logged, and we've got a bit of information about what was discussed. It isn't left for people to piece together after the fact, because that just results in this thing happening again and again and again. So that was a classic like politicians fudge answer there, I think. But if I'm ever in charge of all transparency regulation in Westminster, I would say we need to keep the interchange between Whitehall and business, but we need to have transparency over what happens and what's discussed.
And this is quite this is a very broad one, but do you think Greensill is Cameron's legacy?
Oh, that's a good one. There's a good column in that one, right? It depends what your political position is, right? So he was also the guy who made the Conservatives electable again, took them into government, surprisingly won an election in 2015 that a lot of pundits thought he wouldn't win. Probably his longer term legacy is going to be the Brexit referendum, having called that and lost and had to go. But this definitely tarnishes Cameron's legacy. And I think I sort of touched on this at the start. The hypocrisy angle with this story is quite strong, in that a prime minister who spoke passionately about transforming lobbying regulation and bringing this stuff out into the open has found himself at the heart of the story, which is about exactly the opposite happening. So it's going to be part of the story for forever, I think, even if it's not number one thing historians write.
And I'll do from the chat as well. So do you think in-house lobbyists are ever going to become regulated in the same way as agencies, or are the barriers there just too high to kind of get over?
I thought it was interesting that you had Cameron himself come out and say he would now back in-house lobbyists being included on the register. But the other bit he said was, provided that doesn't place too much of a burden on charities and campaigners. And I think the minute you begin talking about a register of lobbying rather than lobbyists, as we've got at the moment, as one particular kind of lobbyist, you immediately come up with the problem of defining lobbying, and there's probably a whole session in its own right on doing that. But you would expect immediate pushback from, for example, trade unions, from charities, from people who say, we're not lobbyists, we just try to make the case for government to do policy differently. So I think there is a huge job of work to do if the government does want to do that, does want to define it that way. And then there's the question of enforcing that. Frankly, Orkle at the moment does not have loads of money to do its job. So if you do broaden it out, you're going to have to answer the question of how are we going to fund this, which, at a time when people are looking at this sort of public purse strings, might not be a hugely popular option if the answer is more public money. So I would be skeptical about that. That feels like the biggest thing the government could do, and I think it would probably require primary legislation. It would probably require a huge process that I don't sense the political appetite for. So we may just end up with Orkle plus some tighter ACABA regulations and a bit more transparency. But that one feels top of the pile to me, really.
And another Cameron one, how long do you think the sort of Cameron effect, with all of this focus on government transparency and lobbying, is going to last for? I think it feels like the government's had an easier time of it than maybe they would have if it had been one of their sitting ministers that was involved in this. It feels like they kind of are able to say, well, this isn't a problem with us because it's a former prime minister as opposed to a sitting member of government. Do you think if something similar happens again, they'll be able to kind of have the same approach to tweaking things around the edges rather than kind of really going for full-blown change.
I think you picked up on a kind of really important point there, Lizzie, about, you know, this is in some ways the old guard, and you saw that with the Treasury in the end getting quite proactive with publishing Rishi Sunak's texts. You know, although an FOI triggered it, they did come out with the information as a way of saying, look, the old lot asked, but we stood firm on it. And I think there is some politics around that doesn't inhibit the change. The government can rightly say David Cameron lobbied and didn't get what he wanted. The system therefore works. But it would be quite a depressing outcome if we had to have this conversation again in 5 years' time when the next big lobbying scandal happens, because these seem to come in sort of 5-yearly cycles. There's something this big where it's on the front pages and we have to have this conversation again. And, you know, people like the PRCA have to make cases I'm sure they're tired of making. One thing I would say to watch out for is when a really great story like the Greensill story breaks, every single editor goes, I need my reporters to go and get something that good. And so there are lots of people now digging around doing lobbying stories. There's an appetite on news desks for lobbying stories. You saw it today in the Times. You know, we're talking about parliamentary passes and APPGs, another aspect to this. So I think there'll be more to come on the journalistic front. I think there'll be more stories that keep up a kind of drumbeat here. And I think, you know, we're going to see the sort of drip of all the different inquiries reporting, which will give us another reason to check back in. So the story doesn't go away. I'm just not sure we're going to get the revolution this time around.
And because the other side of this is the lobbying industry. We all get tarred with the mistakes of people who aren't lobbyists, and you'll kind of hear the constant refrain in the sector is it's another lobbying scandal that's not it's not about lobbyists. The reputation of the industry has taken a knock as a result of this sort of indirect association with kind of, I guess, the sort of dark arts of Westminster in a way. And lots of I feel the public have probably slightly exaggerated view of what the actual job is and who's doing it. How do you think the industry can sort of move on and kind of keep building its reputation as something separate to these sorts of scandals that it never actually gets involved in?
I think that's a difficult one. I mean, in a sense, there's always going to be a little bit of, it's a bit like journalists and estate agents, right? People kind of need them, but no, people don't want to see how it happens. People don't, you know, there's a like a instinctive kind of about it. And I don't know whether the lobbying can ever kind of completely conquer that. But I think what, you know, the industry bodies have done is kind of get out in front of this as soon as the Cameron story broke and said, these are our principles, this is what needs to change. We're going to be proactive about this. We've already been talking to government about this, and we don't think this is acceptable either. I think that does allow it to distinguish itself from the shadier side of what goes on. I think aligning, you know, I think it's notable that industry groups will align themselves with like Transparency International and will make the joint case that more openness here would help with this problem. So I think being proactive does help address that. I'm not entirely sure that you can, you know, lobbying is never going to be anybody's favorite profession on the outside. I would actually be really interested to hear from, and maybe people could just like drop me an email afterwards, from listeners, whether they've sensed in their engagement with government or even with MPs any change since the Cameron story, whether the shutters have kind of gone down again or people are more wary, because I think in some senses that would be a shame if people are abiding by the rules and are declaring what they do. That would be an annoying knock-on effect, I think, for a lot of people in the industry who rightly feel like we've got nothing to do with what David Cameron did.
And this is again a quite broad one, but how do you think lobbying in Westminster compares to other kind of big kind of European countries? So, is it different to the way that you'd see the process work in Brussels or Paris?
Brussels, this is really interesting. I've got colleagues. There's a London influence, not a London influence. Sorry, there's a Brussels influence and a Paris influence. So I talk to the guys who work in Paris and Brussels a fair bit about this, and there's definitely distinct cultures, and again across the pond in the US as well. There's a distinct culture. I think we are, in terms of lobbying of the European Union, we're behind the curve in terms of disclosure and what's declared. But then Brussels is, like, lobbying is a massive part of what goes on there, whereas I think it's a smaller part of what goes on at Westminster. And so I think they're, in a sense, that the fact that lobbying happens on such a vast scale in Brussels means that the transparency system has had to be more robust and has had to catch up. I think there's a bit of a sort of sleepiness still in Westminster about how we police these things. We are looking to copy other countries in some senses. So what will be really interesting to watch is, well, interesting for nerds like me, is the Foreign Agents Registration Act that the government's thinking about at the moment, and it's looking to the US example to track people who are lobbying on behalf of potentially hostile foreign states. Now that would be a big leap forward for transparency that we'd be nicking from the US. So there's lots of ideas. Scotland's register, for example, is a little bit further ahead than Westminster's is. There's definitely ideas we could nick, but there are distinct cultures as well, so you can't always transplant them.
Actually, on the Scotland point, has anybody in Westminster been holding up the Scottish example as a model that could be used for Westminster lobbying in terms of the transparency of disclosures? Is there any kind of interest in that as a solution?
I'm not sure people are thinking that far ahead yet. I imagine it will come up in the inquiries that are going on. I know Transparency International, in their evidence to the Cabinet Office, pointed to the Scottish example and said, look, this is already a system that's quite similar to our own, with some modifications, particularly around special advisor contact and contact with officials below the top level. So yeah, I think you can expect to see that one get held up as the inquiries press on.
And do you get any sense that in terms of the select committee inquiries that are happening, do you think that when they report, and they're obviously going to report at different times, which might kind of lessen the impact of them, but do you think that there's any kind of there's going to be any kind of renewed pressure as a result of those? Are they going to be? Do you get the sense that they're going to be particularly kind of critical of the government, or is it going to be more of a kind of standard process type inquiry for the most of them?
I think you'll get a lot of sound and fury probably from the Treasury and Bayes kind of inquiries, because they're looking into specifics of Greensill, and I think I don't want to preempt those, but there's likely to be some condemnation of the way the government handled that specific issue. The one I'm keeping an eye on is the Public Administration Committee inquiry, because the Cabinet Office has to report into the Public Administration Committee with its lobbying proposals anyway. So there's already that dialogue between PACAC and the Cabinet Office, which is ultimately how we'll learn what the Cabinet Office is thinking. And they are looking at the kind of plumbing and the actual infrastructure of Westminster's transparency system. So they've previously been critical of the scope of ORCL. They've been critical of the scope of ACABA, essentially called for it to be abolished. These are predecessor inquiries, but they give you a sense of where they might go. So I would be looking out for that one. Now, I'm not sure people are going to be manning the barricades with a Public Administration Committee report, but they are well regarded in Whitehall and in the Cabinet Office, and their recommendations are taken seriously, and the Cabinet Office will have to respond and explain why it's not doing X, Y, Z if it's not doing it, or say we agree with all these recommendations and we're going to implement them in full, which will give us loads to write into that.
And I think just to close from questions, what do you get the sense that the general reception to this sort of story has been across Westminster? Is it sort of surprised that Cameron behaved like this? Is it actually they're not surprised at all that this has been waiting to happen for a while now, or just with a question of who, or is there something else going on in terms of the reaction from Parliament?
I was quite surprised actually by what felt like the sincerity of the reaction to this, not just from Labour, not just from people who you would expect to criticise the government, but from Conservative MPs who felt that this was kind of unbecoming of the institution of Prime Minister. People who care about institutions, people who care about propriety, I think felt that this was a step too far. I think there was genuinely, Westminster can sometimes be quite a sort of jaded place where people go, oh, that's just how it is here. This didn't feel like that. This felt a bit more like people were genuinely quite astonished by the scale of it, by the brazenness of it. And it sort of challenged their preconceptions, I think, about both about David Cameron and about the system we have in place to stop things like this happening.
I think in a way that's quite reassuring. I'm going to end the Q&A there. That was, thank you everybody for some really great questions, and thank you, Matt, for answering them so eloquently. That's been incredibly interesting. Monica, have you got any closing remarks before we finish up?
I just wanted to say a huge thanks to Matt as well, because this has been incredibly insightful, and a huge thanks to you, Lizzie, for having some really, really great questions and leading on the conversation. I think that this turned out great, and yeah, totally agree that people have had some amazing questions.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for stopping by to listen to the conversation. Thank you again, Matt, for being a wonderful insight into what's going on with quite a complicated story at the moment. And we look forward to reading about the results of this in London Influence over the next few months.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.